Part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried-up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "Listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said Herbert. "Maurice said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't lay a finger on the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table to go to work. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, she was laughing at her husband, who was naive enough to believe such stories. "Herbert will make more funny judgments, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "But all aside, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "You thought it did," said the old lady, trying to calm him. "I say it did," replied the other. "I had just, what's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden firmness of mind pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, and put it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her furtively and seemed to be thinking of something else as the old lady said she was sorry for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, which he usually wore in the garden. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and bent down and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Meggins." The old lady jumped suddenly. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband spoke before he could answer. "Sit down, and don't jump to a conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," eyed the stranger, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank." She fell silent as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly so as not to look directly at her, but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath, and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly. "Yes." He sat staring out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he used to do when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to pass on their sadness about your great loss," he said, without looking. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath unheard. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant major might have carried into his first battle. "I have to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "But, although they don't believe that they have a legal requirement to make a payment to you for your loss, in consideration of your son's services they wish to present you with a certain sum." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips said the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Without hearing his wife scream, the old man smiled weakly, put out his hands like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor.